Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankar Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Today we have Sharifah, the CPO of IntentHQ. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Ankar. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, we're really fortunate to have you here on the show. And here at Pioneers, we love the background, the backstory of every single person on the show. So we'd love to hear yours, how you got to become the Chief Product Officer at IntentHQ, you know, what really got you on this path here.
Thanks, Ankar. Yeah, wow. So trying to condense 40 odd years into a couple of minutes. Let me give that a go. So I'll cover that from a professional angle, but also given the topic today, which is an area that I'm really passionate about in terms of diversity, I'll cover some of the roots of how that came to life as well. So been in the tech sector for over 20 years now. Started my career in Southeast Asia in the telco space during the height of the dot-com bubble. Worked my butt off to launch the first wireless broadband in Malaysia. So very familiar with 802.11 technology. And then I was really jaded. I invested in the stock market, went back to school, and actually decided to study a multidisciplinary subject, which was gender, and actually gender and policy, because policy is my end goal once I retire from the tech sector. But I think in that first formative years of being a female in tech, it was really hard for me, Ankar. I remember being, and this is like, I don't know, year 2000 maybe, and I was in Korea, because Korea is one of the forefront tech sectors for broadband. And because my name is non-gender specific, they didn't think that it was going to be a female that would rock up, right? Let alone someone in her 20s. So they didn't meet me. So yeah, and so it was hard. And after doing the hours, because I was working for actually an angel investor who is a great guy, great mentor for me, I decided to go back to school. And after doing a gender degree at the London School of Economics that has an amazing gender institute, I got to work with the UN, a lot of NGOs, and really kind of even look at, my thesis was actually looking at how technology could bridge the gender gap and having a policy perspective. So it was a really fun time. And then I worked as an analyst at Frost & Sullivan, which coincidentally was a US-based company, and I was in London at that time. Grew the practice and started to dabble with very early days of graph theory. So using social network analytics, SNA it was then called, and then the bubble burst. And so I thought I was going to go back to school. So I applied for a PhD position at Cambridge, and everything was all set up, and I was going to use digital footprints to analyze how men and women work differently remotely, right? So my hypothesis, and this was 15 years ago, pre-COVID, that we would at one point saturate in terms of urbanization, and enterprises would force or governments would incentivize people to move out into suburban areas. So my thesis was to look at how enterprises could understand how we have different patterns, particularly working parents between moms and dads, and how they as enterprises should think about policies and use technology to leverage the workforce that's more remote. I didn't end up doing that because I was non-EU, so it was really expensive. Instead, I went to my first startup, and that was where I truly fell in love with analytics, and it was an Israeli startup. So it was baptism by fire. It was Sunday through Friday, covering, 3 different continents, but I fell in love with the space. I think I earned some stripes from a data science perspective. It was sold to IPG here in the US. I took the summer off and then joined Intent, which is the current scale up I'm at. And we're doing some really cool stuff around customer AI. And so that's where I am today. So combination of that and a very interesting patriarchal upbringing, been subject to the whole works, racial, sexual, gender, class discrimination, particularly in good old England. It's been quite a journey for me. So I've hung low, but I think it's about time now in my 40s to support other women, but also using AI to help diversity and inclusion. So more stories to share there.
Yeah, no, incredible. I think that speaks to the challenges that you've encountered, right? And I think the aspiration is that some of those challenges are being overcome. Now, I think AI gets touted as a technology can help level the playing field, at least when it comes to discrimination and bias in hiring processes, for example, right? AI being, let's say, a more objective, I guess it's a more objective decision maker when it comes to hiring, right? Like which candidates to surface and who to hire. That's one area. I'm just curious. Are you actually seeing that? Are we seeing that in practice where AI is helping level the playing field when it comes to overcoming and overlooking, let's say, racial bias or gender discrimination? Or do you feel that that it's still maybe propagating some of the biases that have existed in the past?
So I hold a glass half full on this one, Ankur. I truly believe, and I'll walk through some examples, if I may, of how there have been a couple of, actually a number of cool AI startups in this space that have truly tried to level the playing field. But before I go there, let's think about when Facebook and Google started to use algorithms for their recruitment. And you may remember, right? So anyone who has a certain name, and I think it was Chad, and who played lacrosse in university and went maybe to Princeton, would get the job at Google or Facebook, right? And so it was highly problematic. Obviously, they realized after several fines and legal actions. But I think just from a recruitment perspective, it's really comes back. And actually, another anecdote to share. So I was in Malaysia over the summer speaking to the Sovereign Wealth Fund there. They have a presence in the Valley too. And they asked me to come in and talk about AI and DI and how they should be thinking about it. And when I shared some of the best practices that at least our company tries to apply around recruitment, like, there are no photos and you don't see the name, you ideally don't see the university, the pedigree, right? So you're basically going through merit and experience. They were just flabbergasted. Like, there was no way they would interview a candidate without, seeing how we look like. So I think it has really strong potential, clearly different from market to market, where different cultural and business practices still need to change. So that's one really simple example. I think the landscape's changed, and at Intent, we take that seriously. And I know we're going to talk about how AI and biases get built into the models as well. But if you think about it from a representation perspective, you have to have the diversity to come up with diverse goods to detect the biases, right? So I think recruitment is a huge area, which I'm really happy to see so many startups. And in fact, I met your colleague in Toronto recently, and we were on a panel talking about, how AI today really can help also support talent management and workforce management. And there are startups like Testio that enable companies to understand gendered language, right? There's also another startup called Diversio that's been in your previous space, Ankur, so in the financial private equity space, highly masculine. And so through AI, they have been inbuilt into the performance management systems to detect problematic gendered language, but also, which is super cool, to recognize the talents that some, I guess, more. I know nature and nurture is a tough question. We don't have time to debate that here, but some more feminine traits, right? And so how do businesses cultivate that and lean into that, right? And so I think from a recruitment, talent management, there's so much potential there. And I'll call out a third area, which is surveillance. And I know it's a bit of a dirty word, but if you think about a lot of the chat rooms today, a lot of our Zoom conversations, everything's recorded. Yeah. So I can see a place in time where, this conversation, gets flagged. We may, again, through unconscious bias, say things that perhaps aren't necessarily appropriate, and that gets flagged up. And I know that's, then you come into ethics and governance, but I think there's a space for that. I also think there's a space for a virtual assistant in the room. And I know, you might have been in many boardrooms that are highly masculine, where they're perhaps a very, very low representation of minority cohorts. And so I think in that space, it may, and I haven't personally been involved in experiments here, but it may help minority groups have a greater voice to know that is a form of policing taking place. It might provide some reassurance, but of course it comes down to the governance of how that assistant behaves and reacts. So lots of potential there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, and I think the challenge is realizing that potential. How do you introduce technology that can help address the gaps and the biases that have existed for a long time? Because in one perspective, because the AI is training on data that already has inherent bias, right? Because we have all of this data that came from years, decades, maybe century-old data sets that we've accumulated. It propagates a lot of that. Just the nature of AI, it's the greatest autocomplete, right? As it's often called. And so it propagates into the future biases that we've had. But at the same time, if you are able to use it to, for example, identify where a bias is occurring in hiring decisions or in the workplace or in chat rooms, you just get more visibility into this than you ever had before, right? And again, you don't want to necessarily go into like a police state where you're observing every single conversation or communication that you're having within the company, but it does, when used properly, help identify where that could be occurring, and so you could really intervene, right, and kind of course correct instead of letting that fester for a long time. But at the same time, it has to come top down, right? The management, the executive team needs to be supportive of such an initiative. Otherwise, it won't happen, even if the technology exists out there.
Absolutely, which kind of takes us full circle, right? Which is why for me and for the businesses I represent, the recruitment, the workforce, the talent pool is really, really critical. Whether it's the top down, whether it's the modeling, whether it's the validation of the biases within the models. I think we have some way to go as a sector, but I think we're seeing more leadership, right? We're seeing Mira Moretti at OpenAI. We're seeing, I think, the more women we can have in leadership positions, the greater the chance for change. And then not just women, right? I think underrepresented communities as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So I think stepping into a slightly adjacent topic, which is, obviously you see the advent of a lot of remote first companies, right? People that are hiring remotely, hiring across the United States, for example, or around the world. How do you think about having an inclusive culture? This topic really spans even beyond AI, but having an inclusive culture and then addressing pay, right? Pay is a huge thing where it's like, if you're like we are a US-based firm, we have talent around the world. How do we think about what is equitable pay, right? Depending on what are the supply and demand for any single individual and the country that they live and living costs and such. How do you have a proper framework, maybe at IntentHQ or just more broadly around those topics?
Yeah, okay, so if I think of it, just let me replay that question, Ankur, because I think you touched on two big areas. One was inclusion, particularly in a hybrid work environment. And then there's the gender pay gap.
Yeah, right.
So let's tackle hybrid work, just because we're both working in hybrid environments today. It's not easy. It's not easy, I think, to in terms of recruitment as a business, we try to meet face to face. At least a part of that interview process does happen face to face. From a team perspective here, so when we set up the US office, we made sure that the team gets together at least once a quarter. The economics of it, I think it's easier for us because we're relatively small, but could also be built into a people policy. But it could be a scenario that, and it could be mathematical depending on the radius, how far you are from having to travel. Maybe the company pays two trips a year, and you pay for the other two trips with the understanding that those trips will be planned in advance. So we've certainly put in some mechanisms in place that worked really well for some of employees. And of course, post-COVID, we had some employees move further out to take advantage of, different tax conditions, but also just wanting different lifestyles. So I think there are ways that can certainly work. I do feel the face-to-face interaction still remains a critical part, particularly for, I think, the younger generation. And there's so much literature on this, so I won't go into detail with that, but suffice to say, for us, and in my experience, having an office space where people can get together really does help. In terms of gender pay, gosh, again, underneath all of this, Uncle, why am I excited about AI? Why am I in this space if my end state is policy? I truly believe in the power of data. I know it sounds cliche, but the more data that we can show and allow for what I believe to be super powerful, which is introspective analysis, I think that would be a game changer. So coming back to gender pay gaps, it will surface in the data. I know a lot of people joke about how remote working has kind of leveled the playing field a bit, because we're not all out on the golf courses where you have that kind of gender bias. But unfortunately, it's coming back again. So I think what I'm seeing is that COVID's given us a wake up call, recognizing the value of domestic work and maternal care, whether that's for children or for elderly. One of the things I did actually when I was at LSE was to try and put a monetary amount on that. I lobbied that hard, even with the United Nations, both here in the US and in developing countries. It's very politically fraught, right? No politician in their right mind would today be very happy to assign economic value to domestic care. And it's a power dynamic. How do we level that out? I don't yet have an answer, Uncle. I hope to one day. But it's very imbued. There's a lot of politics, and unfortunately, even post-COVID, now we see, the golf courses, starting to be populated again. You're always going to have, a different playing field between men and women. It can change. We've seen Google invested in Chief, the network, which I was a member of for a year, to try and create that, female solidarity and women's network to kind of not necessarily compete with the all boys clubs, but at least give room and space for women to engage in. I think that's really powerful too. I think you can see through LinkedIn there's just, a mushrooming of women's groups, women in AI. Every sector has a women's group today. So slowly but surely, finally, I'd say the onus also sits, to your point, top down, but also sits on boards, right? So I think it does sit with the accountability does sit with board members to ensure that the gender pay gap is bridged.
Right. That makes sense. I think those are incredible thoughts, and I think that you've done a great job breaking that down. How it could potentially be addressed, right? And I think one of the things that that I often see in New York City, at least here, is there are a lot of initiatives to get women in technology, right? And women in finance, being New York City is very finance oriented, and then more recently, women in AI. I'm curious what your thoughts are about. Have we gotten further along in getting more, um, uh, basically more engagement for young women, especially that are starting out their careers, to be engaged in the tech world, in AI, right? Because I think the hard part is like once you're on the outside looking in, it's harder to break in. So really, it's crucial that the very early on in someone's career, even starting in high school or college, that there is a path for them to be a part of this space, right? Get internships, get the coveted first year roles, and then like you just really continue that journey throughout. Do you think that we've gotten a little bit further along, and if not entirely there, what gaps remain today?
Definitely further along. I mean, certainly from when I started my career, Ankur, for people not wanting to meet me, despite some credibility, um, I think it differs from sector to sector. So you called out finance, which is which is a tricky area, and there is a school of thought that I know you were a quant trader once. It's a very testosterone fueled sector, right? You take risks, and that's a masculine trait. Um, but I think in technology, and I look at the stats and the data, more women are graduating with STEM degrees, right? And so I'll bring it home again, just because it's I hope a useful anecdote for our listeners. At Intent, we took deliberate steps when we recruit for data scientists. We designed the interview process where you do a technical assessment up front, right? So out of the gate, it's your creds. Then you do the cultural fit, you do the aspirations, because women tend not to, and again, I'm generalizing, but just data shows that that's where they fall, or that's where they have a disadvantage to their male peers. And that's, again, it's totally in the data. There's a book, well-known book called The Confidence Code, and it's quotes stats, and they did numerous research studies at Stanford. The male will always perform better in a qualitative interview because they will demand for a higher salary. They will overstate their credibility. And so for us, reversing that process, Ankur, has helped. And we've been able to bring in a lot more amazing women onto our tech teams through that process. So I think it's a matter of time. So we've got the talent pool. We've got great leadership, as we talked about earlier, in the space that are, increasingly female faces, female names. Mm-hmm. But then if you go into our world or startups, the VC sector, and again, the data isn't great, women founders who are invested by other women founders will underperform. And so that, to me, Ankur, is enigma. I mean, it's going to take time, right? It's going to take time where we're going to see that data change. There's a lot. And I as I mentioned, I've done extensive work with the UN to try and see how we can get women not just to enter the workforce regardless of sector, but also to stay within the workforce. And unfortunately, women still are the primary maternal carers. And if you look at most countries around the world, employment stats fall off a cliff for women after the age of 30 because they become childbearing or they have to look after an elderly. But again, let's take a positive perspective. It's definitely changed. We're definitely seeing more graduates. Really, I think girls are doing amazingly well academically. And actually, I was speaking to one of the board members in a big fashion retailer here in the US, and she's ex-Goldman, and she said that she's actually worried for the boys, Ankur. So she's seeing men today kind of losing their voice, if you like. And if I look at my 10-year-old daughter, I can't believe a scenario where she won't take any crap. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's positive in general, the trajectory at least. There's more work to be done, but we're far in a far better place than we were even 10 years ago, right? So
Absolutely.
I think that's something to at least be optimistic about. I'm curious now, turning a little bit of the attention to Intent HQ. You do customer AI. How do you work with any identifying any gendered or biased language when it comes to corporate communications or any of the natural language that you work with today?
A few ways, and we try and preach what we practice. So we actually have tools. We've tested several tools, I should say. In Slack, for example, we have a bot that calls out when you might be typing inappropriate language, so you get called out on it. But at Intent, it's a key part of our culture, because we're so diverse. So we have offices in London, Lisbon, Barcelona, Tel Aviv, and here in the US. So amidst that diversity, Ankur, I guess I was going to say that you have no choice, but I guess the default position is to try and be more inclusive. Even across the gender spectrum, we have fair representation. And so I think from a leadership perspective, we've done pretty well to make sure that the culture is inclusive. And it does boil down to leadership. Our chairman, he's been a fund manager for 30, 40 years now. And he is a strong champion for diversity within the business. And I'm very fortunate to have his leadership and our CEO's leadership, where they've been able to create a very inclusive culture. So from a technology perspective, aside from the tools I mentioned, we do have some recruitment processes where we're very cognizant of bringing in women, but also not discriminating any minority groups. We have a very active DEI committee, which we actually call Connect with Intent. I found that DI in it is quite political in itself. So what am I trying to accomplish by chairing that committee? I'm trying to build connections, right? At the end of the day, we are a community of colleagues. And for me, the more appropriate term was connecting with intent, right? And kind of taking a bit of our company branding to there. And so the goal of that committee, Ankur, is we are running engagement surveys. We work with our people team to release stats, but we also run initiatives, all the formal training that you can think of. But also, actually, what I found has been really cool is actually working with our partners. So we recently did a joint panel with Databricks, where we invited their diversity team to come in and share their experiences with us. And so for me, I realized that it has to expand beyond just intent into our partner ecosystem. So both with our clients, we have very active dialogue around how we promote diversity and how we create a more inclusive environment. And with our partners, our suppliers, we also have a dialogue. So we're kind of opening it up to the wider ecosystem and hope that other companies do the same, and that you'll have an exponential impact.
That's great. I mean, I think that gives us a little bit more insight into sort of how you're doing it at Intent specifically. And I think one of the questions that I've had for some time, and I think this is relevant, is how do you overcome some of the challenges you face when you implement AI for diversity and inclusion, right? Is it technical in nature? Is it more people related? So overcoming the inertia from the people side, getting them involved. Maybe if you could talk through some of the biggest challenges you faced in implementing AI for diversity and inclusion and how you address them, that would be really helpful.
Oh, happy to. Let's start with the data. I think we touched on this earlier on, where, to your point, society is just imbued with biases, right? So problem number one is the models, because the data makes up and the model generates output based on a trained set of data, right? And we see some of the challenges with LLM today. So when we build the models, so again, coming back to the individuals that are building those models, Ankur, and some people might think it's cliche, or you got to have a diverse team of developers and data scientists, but we truly believe that, because if your model output looks biased and you're part of the bias, you're not really going to flag that or correct that. So that's one, right? And as you know, with fine tuning, there's a human feedback interaction in it, right? So it still boils down to humans to be able to correct and fine tune the models. The second part of what we do in particular is the visualization. So we do we do our best, and this goes back to the ethos of the company of trying to bring in a human understanding of the data, right? So people like you and me and our friends can actually really understand what that data means. So we have really sophisticated visualization capabilities that will then surface the biases. There is still, though, the problem when you visualize, you have to label. Even through building the model, you have to label. And actually was just debating with my data scientist before coming on this call, how do I address that question of labeling? And again, it comes back to who's making that label, right? So let's say we find a homophobic group of people that are not based on demographics. Mm-hmm. How do we label it? And how do we make sure that labeling isn't biased and is inclusive? The only way you can do that is if you have a group of diverse people coming together to agree on that labeling. Arguably, it's a bit more work. Arguably, it takes more time rather than just having one person do it. But we're very invested in that. So those I think would be the couple of ways. So one was bias detection within model build. Second is post-model build validation. And then third, visualization. Because when you start to articulate data points, that's where you can really start to see the systemic biases that came through or didn't come through in the data. I'll share one final analogy, which I'm really excited, and I haven't yet cracked it because we're still in development phase. So we're working with an MVNO in Mexico to use Edge AI, which is a new capability for us, basically on device, to be able to help inform credit models. And it's a thing here too in the US, I think, particularly post-COVID with the informal economy, more credit models are not as accurate as they used to be. But in this case, in Latin America and a lot of developing countries, women in particular tend to have to pay, extortionary credit rates, right? Interest rates, right? Yeah, I mean, talking like 50, 60, 80% APR to buy the washing machine, right? And so what we're doing is we're using Edge AI to be able to collect data of, again, largely underrepresented groups of women who are not in the formal economy to better inform credit models. Sure. In that, Ankur, there's so many problems in that, right? Like, how do you gather the data? And what if this particular individual was, very punctual at her workplace, but the workplace might not be a very, socially acceptable type of job, right? And so how do you balance the ethics around that? And so we're working with universities, we're working with policymakers to try and find the right balance to be able to collect the right level of data. And it, unfortunately, in its first instance, may not be possible to fully anonymize, but we do want to get to the end state where we can rely on patterns rather than individuals. So I haven't cracked that problem fully yet, but I'm again very excited, optimistic that that's an area, for example, where AI is kind of, I'd say, treading in more dangerous territory, but for the betterment of these women, because they spend their entire life just paying off interest payments.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I think we don't normally hear AI for good, but in this case, it's microfinancing, which has been around for a long time. Microloans, for example, in instances like the washing machine, they're still very biased. The underwriting process is biased. The punitive rates, and this is where artificial intelligence, when applied to these problems with enough context, can help de-risk the opportunity with data that's hard to otherwise process. And then it helps assign better rates to these individuals. And so you end up getting something that's a lot fairer, right? And something that isn't punitive, like you mentioned. Are there other areas that you think about where AI could do a lot of good, and particularly from a diversity and inclusion perspective, where these problems used to be really hard to solve, but given where large language models are today, now all of a sudden you could solve them in a better way, and so problems that were hard now become tractable with inclusion and diversity in mind.
Absolutely. We haven't touched on education, Ankur, but if you think about neurodiverse children, right? Accessibility to different types of content, different modes of learning. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of startups out there today that are using AI to cater for special needs. I'm really excited about that. I think they are geniuses in their own right. We as educators just haven't found the right way to educate them. So I think there's a burgeoning space in AI and in education. I also think that as technology progresses at a more macro level from an AI perspective, the cost of access will decrease. And we're seeing that, across the world. I think AI has become cheaper, if I can say that, more accessible, perhaps better term. And I think that opens up, again, a wealth of knowledge that, I certainly didn't have access to, with still the Britannica encyclopedias. So I think that's a space that we should all be really optimistic of. Now, of course, how do you filter? How do you censor? How do we, have accountability within the media or the content that AI produces? I think that's an area where we as an industry have yet to figure out around governance. So I'd say, for me at least, things that are close to my heart and I'm excited about, that would be education. It would be access to knowledge, and dealing with, moving out of these stereotypes that we've all grown up with, right? That there is only one path of success. I think AI opens that up, certainly, and I am more optimistic now about doing my PhD, knowing that I may not necessarily have to write the volumes.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think it's exciting.
When you look at artificial intelligence and this race for building large language models, and I think we hear a couple of things. One, that it's very, very risky for a single closed source player like an OpenAI to own the entire LLM space. I'm not saying that's the case, because you have so many other closed source LLM players. You have Meta releasing open source models, but how risky is it for there to be only one of, let's say, 12 closed source / open source models that are available that the world is relying on? And the reason why I bring this up is the US is leading the pack when it comes to LLM model development, especially at the foundation game. There are others that have some innovation coming out, like in Saudi Arabia and UAE and China and other places, but it doesn't feel like this is an equal game. There's certain countries and certain segments, even in those countries, that are wholly owning foundation model development, and everyone else seems to be getting left behind. Is that something that we should be concerned about, or are the concerns overblown in that case?
Oh gosh, I would say, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, if you look at any technological advancement, it was not unilateral. It was, across the continents, there wasn't the same speed of growth and access. So I think historically, if I look at the evolution of sophistication, it has been born in different parts of the world at different points in time, and different countries or different societies have been able to gain competitive advantage as a result of that. And so from a purely economic perspective, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And part of the reason I think the US is slightly ahead more of the game is because it's made the investments there, right? So it wasn't like a natural right. It's not like it's not going to oil and gas, but it invested in it, and there's a populace of scientists, and actually, Ankur, and that's part two of the American dream, right? It attracts great talent, and if you look at a lot of the AI developments, they are second, third generation immigrants coming into the US that have developed these really cool technologies, right? And not having to go further than Google and looking at that diverse talent pool. So from that perspective, I don't think it's problematic. I do worry about the policing and the governance, particularly in today's geopolitics, because of what AI can do for warfare and intelligence in that perspective. That to me is worrying. And so I think governments are right to be worried about it. I know that, that this becomes the next big topic at any World Trade Convention, whether it's Davos or any of the APAC blocks. But I think it will need to find a way to catch up and balance out. But again, with any development we've had globally, you're going to have your leaders and you're going to have your laggards.
I think that's right. I think the technological dissemination isn't ever equal. It doesn't flow at the same rate, right? It's a question of are countries, our population going to be left behind in terms of this arms race, right? And what type of outcomes does it have long term with a few leading the pack? It's but kind of clear why the U.S. is leading the pack for the reasons you mentioned, right? Which is risk taking, capital, the fact that we're investing from past successes, so the rich get richer in that sense. So, but yeah, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. In a way, I think for the consumer, it's been amazing because given where the internet is, unlike the Industrial Revolution, the technology can be in the hands of everyone around the world instantly.
Right. It can. Yeah, it's so accessible, right? So coming back to what we covered off earlier, yeah, it definitely does provide for more equity in that sense.
Yeah. I think the concern is, though, that I think in a way, for better or worse, 10, 15 years ago, I think a lot of roles that people were doing in the US or in other high cost centers were being done by overseas labor, which ended up being a boon to those areas because they got to do a little bit like the whole offshoring, right? They got to do more work, they got to earn more pay, paid by American corporations. Now, the worry that I often hear in some of the circles is because artificial intelligence is so capable, all of that offshoring that was done, that was creating great income for people around the world in places like, let's say, the Philippines, that is now being brought back onshore and then automated away using artificial intelligence. So I'm curious, if you're concerned at all about this, or if we should be concerned about this, or whether that might be, again, an overblown risk.
Yeah, so I think the loss of jobs through AI has been subject of many dinner conversations, I'm sure for you as well, amongst friends and family. Yeah, I have a more positive outlook for this. I think on aggregate, I think AI has more opportunities for us to still harness upon. The loss of jobs, and I think it was a McKinsey piece published over the summer where they looked at the actual income cohorts that were going to be impacted. And I'll talk about the US and I'll come back to your Philippine example. But it was actually people with lower to mid income that were going to be affected, Anko, which was quite a surprise because everybody thought it was going to be the lower income. But we actually still need the low cost labor, right?
Right.
To clean our streets, to trim our trees, whatever it is. So now that loss of employment in low to median cohorts is slightly problematic given the household composition, the average household count for those cohorts. So I think the idea of reskilling is something that we need to pay close attention to. How do we reskill and provide employment for these people? Because then them being unemployed becomes not just a burden to society, but a potential longer term development stunt, right, for the country. Right. In terms of offshoring and the impact of that, I don't know if anybody believed offshoring was going to be a long-term sustainable model. I certainly, I had leading a team of analysts. I'd offshored a team in India. It was hard, and today when I do the math, it's not necessarily economically as advantageous as it used to be. So in some ways, the replacement of that with technology, to me, from a economic standpoint, isn't necessarily a bad thing. Now, what do we do about the loss of employment for those cohorts? I do think there's, again, opportunity for most developing countries and developed countries as well to not just reskill those laborers, but also try and find different ways of employing that. To give you an example. So I have to go through scans every few months, and it was I don't know if it was to a positive surprise or to delight, but I then found out that my scans were run through AI. So this is the classic radiology's job goes away, but those scans were being read in India.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a tech medic in India that was reading my results and passing through what the AI was whether it was detecting anomalies or not. So that's just an example where a set of jobs may disappear, but then another set of jobs might appear, because you still need someone to read it. It's going to be expensive for the nurse here to do it. I get the information back from the nurse, who has great bedside manners, but there's still opportunity for us to have labor arbitrage in developed versus developing markets, to still kind of build on the offshoring model. But I think it just will the economics of it will look different. And I think that the scope of work will look different too.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think AI ends up disrupting the market. It creates new opportunities while potentially reshaping some existing opportunities, right? And I think it's about adapting to that environment. I think it will be tricky in some cases, but I think it's not all doom and gloom as is often made out to be, right?
Agreed.
So a couple of lightning round questions. I'm curious, for someone that is building in this space, and has to keep up with everything that's happening, where do you turn to for new information, given the pace of new information that comes out more broadly in the AI space?
Wow. I have to say, obviously podcasts are our go-to, Ankur, and I'm delighted that we're contributing to that. I'd also say encourage cross-sector conversations, right? So in this space, and I've been in telecom space for over 20 years now, it's so fascinating to look at other sectors and think about the application of what we do here in the technology sector into other industries. So I think one thing I am really, really enthusiastic about is pollination of data sets. And that in part is part of what we do at Intent. And it's fascinating to be able to pollinate data sets. So I think for me, the learning comes through my professional vocational work as well, where I actually fortunate enough to see the data and how when you bring different data sets together, you create different opportunities and different types of innovation. And then last but not least, it's interesting. I think obviously podcasts and reading and there are so many great books, but I've never been a fan of history. But there's a book that AJ Agarwal, you might be familiar with. It's a version 2 of his first book, Prediction Machines, just called Power and Prediction, and he draws this analogy of electricity and how when it was first invented, right? You remember the graph? So 50 years or something like that before it became mainstream in the US. And it required us to move from point solutions and understand the adoption of electricity as a system. And so for me to use that analogy and come back to the cross-industry learnings, but also looking back in time to see how we as humans have adopted different technologies and where the opportunities lie is really powerful. Again, my partner is a great historian. I've always made fun of him for reading so many history books, but I think I might have to borrow a few one of these days.
Yeah, I think there are lessons to be learned there, because there have been many technological inflection points, and this is just another very large one, right? And I think there's some patterns that often play out. They will always be the same, but it'll be similar enough where I think we can draw upon basically past examples, right, to then take with us as we kind of build for the present and the future. So to wrap things up, I'm curious, what's some advice that you'd give yourself that you wish you'd given yourself at the beginning of your career?
It's going to be cliched, Ankur. I look at my younger self today, and I I would have probably like really kind of drummed home to have more confidence. I think confidence is a big thing. We touched lightly on microaggression, but the latest McKinsey report, I think, shows something like the Women in the Workforce report that they published over the summer. Something like 76% of women in junior to middle management positions, I think back my younger self, are highly affected by microaggression, and it is a confidence killer. So if there was one thing I could look back and say, you've got this. And if I had all the data, the Stanford studies to know that my male colleagues were exaggerating, I think that would have helped too. But no, in more seriousness, I think just having more affirmation and self belief would probably, and it's something I tell a lot of women that I mentor, and in the school circuits that I do, I do say to really believe in yourself.
I 100% agree. I mean, especially for some of our listeners that are founders or would be founders, founding a company or being involved in anything that's early stage, something that's net new, is hard because it's never been done before. You're getting said no a lot to, both from VCs and from prospects that you're selling into. And so there's a huge challenge, right? And you feel like you're an imposter, and everything's hard. And sometimes it's almost like you have to be overly confident or confident above and beyond what you might innately feel to overcome that, right? And that's super
Right.
hard. And I think I think that's really important to call out. And there are gender differences, and I think being aware of what that looks like, how to overcome it, I think is really wonderful advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And confidence, but not, and that has to be founded, right? And so that relates to grit, to resilience.
Mhm.
I think Angela Duckworth's book on grit is a good one. It's resilience. It's, have confidence, and there will be challenges, and having that determination and drive and resilience to overcome those challenges, I think would be really powerful.
Yeah. Well, Sharifah, this has been an awesome conversation. Really appreciate you joining the podcast. Where can people learn more about you and your company, IntentHQ?
Sure, it's Sharifah@gmail.com. Easy as that. IntentHQ.com. Really love to have a dialogue. And Ankur, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation too. I hope our listeners have enjoyed it as much as I have in talking to you.
Awesome. Really appreciate you being on the show. Thanks for the amazing conversation, and I'll talk to you soon.